In the most vulnerable moment of her life, fresh out of childbirth and with her baby in her arms, Elena is slapped by the man who swore to protect her. But what seemed like an unpunished attack takes an unexpected turn when her father, Steven Seagal, appears at the hospital. What follows is not a scene from a movie, but the true story of a father determined to break the cycle of violence and protect his family. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. In a small Midwestern town, where glances are quick and rumors even faster, a scandal erupted that no one would ever forget. The story begins in a modest restaurant with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread. There, at a table in the back, sat a woman named Laura, a mixed martial arts champion and local pride. Her life had been an example of discipline, hard work, and respect. That day, however, she wasn't training or competing. She was simply having lunch, trying to blend in. A burly police officer in an impeccable uniform and with an arrogant smile walked in. Everyone in town knew him. Officer Barrett had amassed equal parts power and fear, used to no one daring to challenge him. His boots clattered on the wooden floor as he approached the bar, his eyes fixed on the aura with a gleam that boded ill. The other patrons lowered their gaze. They knew that when Barrett chose someone to humiliate, it was best not to interfere. Laura, accustomed to dealing with much tougher opponents in the octagon, took a deep breath and tried to ignore him. But he wasn't about to let her go. He leaned across her table, making disparaging remarks about her career, her physique, and her private life. Laura responded calmly with a self-control that only true champions possess. Barrett, feeling challenged, lost his composure. In an act as sudden as it was cowardly, he grabbed Laura's plate and shoved it toward her face, covering her in food. The entire restaurant fell silent. The sound of the plate shattering on the floor echoed like a gunshot. Laura, stunned, wiped her face, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes showed not fear, but a dangerous calm. At a nearby table, sitting silently for several minutes, was Steven Seagal. No one had recognized him at first. He was simply dressed in a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He had come to town for personal reasons, hoping to remain unnoticed. But as soon as he witnessed the assault, something inside him ignited. He wasn't just a casual witness. He had known Laura for years, though she didn't know it yet. He had followed her career, admired her integrity, and now to see law enforcement officers abusing their power against her, it awakened in him an uncontrollable protective instinct. The diners exchanged nervous glances. No one moved. Barrett, confident in his authority, smiled, satisfied with his lesson. However, he didn't notice that a legendary man was observing everything, measuring his every move. Steven Seagal slowly rose from his seat. His height and bearing imposed an even deeper silence. He walked toward the table with confident steps, unhurried, but determined. Laura looked at him in surprise. Barrett raised an eyebrow, unable to recognize the man before him. To Barrett, he was just a meddlesome stranger. To everyone else, a moment was unfolding that would go down in the town's history. That wasn't necessary, Steven Seagal said in a deep voice, almost a whisper, but with the authority of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. Barrett turned to him and burst out laughing. "And who are you to tell me how to do my job?" he snapped, taking a step forward. Steven didn't respond immediately. He simply fixed her with a deep gaze, the kind that dismantles any facade. It was the look of someone who had seen too much injustice to tolerate another. Laura, her voice barely a whisper, murmured, Don't get involved. It's dangerous. But Stephen had already made up his mind. The entire room held its breath. The air seemed thicker, heavy with tension. Some discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that something big was about to happen. No one knew that this moment would go viral the next day, that thousands of people would see the scene and comment on it on social media. Barrett, irritated by the stranger's silence, shoved him with his shoulder to get him out of the way. Fatal mistake. Steven Seagal didn't move an inch. His feet remained rooted to the ground. Barrett's smile faltered. Stephen barely inclined his head without breaking eye contact and spoke calmly. A real man protects. He doesn't humiliate. The words echoed through the room. Barrett raised his hand to push him again, but at that instant, Stephen moved his arm with surprising speed. In a fluid gesture, he caught the officer's wrist before he could touch him. It wasn't a violent movement, but precise, technical, controlled. The officer felt a sharp pain and instinctively stepped back. The customers stifled gasps. Laura stood up, still incredulous. Barrett, furious, tried to break free, but Stephen gently released him, giving him space to decide his next steps. It was a silent message. Don't go down that road. The officer breathed heavily, the vein in his neck throbbing. He wasn't used to being challenged, much less in public. But something in the man's gaze made him hesitate. It wasn't just physical strength. It was the confidence of someone who knows exactly what he's doing. Stephen took a step back without losing his composure and walked over to Laura. Are you okay? She nodded, still trembling with adrenaline. Barrett looked around for support, but found only expectant faces and recording phones. The power he had used so many times to intimidate now seemed to vanish in the presence of a single man. That was the moment everything changed. What began as public humiliation became the prelude to a lesson Barrett would never forget. And for Laura, it was the instant she discovered she wasn't alone, that someone had decided to intervene when everyone else remained silent. Outside the restaurant, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange. Fate was about to weave an unexpected twist that would unite the lives of Laura, Barrett, and Steven Seagal in a way no one could have foreseen. At the county hospital, the white light in the hallways reflected an eerie silence. Doctors hurried back and forth, oblivious to the drama about to unfold in the maternity ward. Anna, exhausted after hours of labor, held her newborn son in her arms. Her pale, sweaty face still bore that mixture of fear and hope that only a first-time mother knows. Beside her stood Marco, her husband, a nervous man with a hard gaze and trembling hands. Throughout the pregnancy, he had displayed constant impatience, always complaining, always raising his voice. That afternoon, the tension reached its peak. Anna had barely finished thanking the nurses when Marco, overcome by frustration and anger, slapped her across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the room like thunder. The nurses froze. The baby cried. Anna didn't react with screams or insults. Her eyes merely filled with tears as she pressed the child to her chest. It was a scene that seemed impossible in a place that symbolized life and the beginning of something new. Marco, breathing heavily, realized what he had done, but he didn't apologize. His gaze was lost, as if he were caught in an inner storm. And in that instant, before anyone could intervene, the door burst open. A tall man, imposing in presence, dressed in black, entered. His steps were confident, his gaze as cold as steel. It was Steven Seagal, Anna's father. No one in that hospital expected to see him there, not even his own daughter. He had arrived quietly in town after receiving a desperate call the night before. What he found in that room stopped him in his tracks. His daughter beaten, holding her newborn grandson, and the assailant standing before her. The air shifted. The nurses instinctively stepped back. Marco, seeing the man enter, felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just surprise. It was the presence. That presence of men who don't need to raise their voices to inspire respect or fear. Stephen Siegel said nothing at first. He slowly approached his daughter, gently stroked her hair, and looked at the baby. His expression softened for only a few seconds, only to harden again as he turned back to Marco. His eyes were like blades. "Is this how you treat my daughter?" he asked, his voice heavy, restrained, almost a whisper, but with the weight of 1,000 storms. Marco took a step back, tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the air in his wings had become too heavy. Stephen took another step forward. The nurses stepped aside. No one dared to interrupt what was happening. "I warned you once," Stephen continued. "I told you to respect her, to take care of her, that if you made her cry, you would answer to me." Stephen's voice was like a drum pounding in the chests of everyone present. Marco swallowed, his hands trembling. He tried to justify himself. "It was just a moment, I didn't." But Stephen raised his hand to silence him. He didn't need to hear excuses. His eyes never left Marco's. The tension was so palpable that even the baby stopped crying, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. A real man never raises a hand against a woman, Stephen said with deadly calm, much less against the mother of his child. Marco felt his knees buckle. He tried to compose himself, but Stephen took another step, standing barely a foot away from him. His voice lowered even further. "I'll give you one chance to prove you can be more than a coward." The nurses exchanged glances, unsure whether to call for security or remain still. But no one moved. Stephen's presence filled the entire room. Marco took a step back, but his head hit the wall. He had nowhere else to go. Anna, still holding the baby, looked at her father, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't fear she felt. It was relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt someone was protecting her. Stephen reached out, not for Marco, but for the baby. Anna handed him the baby, trembling. He held the child with a surprising tenderness for such an imposing man. He looked at him, smiled slightly, and whispered, "It's okay, little one. Everything's going to be all right." Then he turned his gaze back to Marco. The smile was gone from his face. Only firmness remained. "If you want to be a part of his life, start by respecting his mother, or you'll never see him again." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Marco nodded weakly, unable to speak. Stephen handed the baby back to Anna, held her gently, and whispered something in her ear that only she could hear. It was a message of strength, of hope. The hospital staff remained motionless, witnessing a scene that seemed straight out of a movie. But for Anna, it was the harshest and yet most comforting reality. Stephen took a step back, but didn't take his eyes off Marco. It was a silent warning. Marco lowered his head, defeated, aware that this man was not like the others. That day, in that room, not only was a child born, but a new opportunity was born for Anna and Marco. A path of confrontation with their own demons began under the shadow of a father who would not allow one more act of violence against his daughter. The following hours in the hospital seemed endless. Anna remained in the maternity ward with her baby asleep on her chest. The initial crying had been replaced by a fragile calm. Outside, the murmur of the nurses and the footsteps of the doctors felt distant, as if everything were happening in another world. Inside the room, however, a thick tension hung in the air, the tension of a change that was just beginning. Stephen Siegel stood by the window, looking out at the gray street of the town. His figure commanded respect, even in silence. Anna watched him, still surprised that her father had appeared at that precise moment. She hadn't seen him in years. He had been away, living a quiet life after intense years, and she had learned not to expect him. Yet there he was, as real and present as when she was a child. "Dad," Anna whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd come." Stephen turned. His expression softened for just a moment. "I told you once, daughter," he replied. "Whenever you need me most, I'll be there." Anna lowered her gaze. It had been so long since she'd felt that protection that it was hard to accept. Stephen approached and slowly adjusted a blanket over her shoulders. His gesture was firm yet tender, like someone trying to remind his daughter that she is still strong even when she feels broken. In the hallway, Marco paced back and forth. Guilt gnawed at him. But so did fear. Not just fear of Stephen, but of himself, of what he had done. He knew that, in that moment, he hadn't been a man. It had been an impulse, an act of cowardice. And now he stood before someone who embodied everything he had never been. Discipline, respect, and control. A nurse approached him. "Sir, would you like to sit down? You're very pale." Marco shook his head. "I need to talk to her," he muttered hoarsely. Inside the room, Stephen looked at his daughter. "Do you want me to see him?" he asked bluntly. Anna hesitated. Part of her wanted Marco to disappear forever. Another part wanted to believe he could change, that there was still something redeemable in the man with whom she had dreamed of a family. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, but I don't want to be alone when I do." Stephen nodded slowly. "You won't be alone." The door opened, and Marco entered with hesitant steps. He stopped when he saw Stephen at his side, holding his gaze like someone wielding an invisible weapon. The room became a silent battlefield. Marco swallowed and looked at Anna. "I'm sorry," he said in a whisper. "I lost control. It won't happen again." Anna didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the baby, gently stroking its head. Stephen took a step forward, positioning himself slightly between them. "It's not me you need to convince," he said calmly, "but I trust every word you say. It's her and that child." Marco lowered his head. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Stephen moved closer. His voice was a murmur, but it filled the entire room. Men are defined by their actions, not their apologies. Marco felt the phrase like a blow to his chest. He looked at Anna, searching her eyes for some sign of forgiveness. She silently continued to cradle the baby. There were tears on her cheeks, but also a newfound strength, a nascent resolve. "If you want to be in her life," Stephen continued, "start by changing. Start now. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient. Now." Marco nodded weakly. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. And this time his voice sounded different, less arrogant, more human. Anna looked up. Her eyes, though moist, were resolute. "Then prove it," she whispered. A heavy silence settled in the room. Outside, it began to rain softly, drops tapping against the windows like a metronome. It was as if the whole world were marking a new beginning. Stephen, without taking his eyes off Marco, placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it held a silent oath. He wouldn't allow her to go through anything like this alone again. Marco took a step back. "I'll leave for now," he murmured. "I need to think." Stephen nodded. but his gaze was a silent warning. Marco understood that this man wasn't just a father. He was a guardian, and if he failed again, there would be no second chances. When the door closed, Anna let out a sob. Stephen held her gently, protecting her without invading her space. "Everything is going to change," he told her. "I promise." She rested her head on his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could breathe. Meanwhile, in the corridor, Marco left the hospital in the rain. Each drop seemed to wash away a little of his anger and shame. His steps were heavy, but something inside him had begun to stir. Perhaps it wasn't too late to become the man he had promised to be. The rain continued to pound against the hospital windows as night fell over the small town. The lights in the corridors grew dimmer, and the air filled with that smell of disinfectant and stale coffee that all hospitals have in the early morning. Anna, still weak, gazed at her sleeping baby. Her breathing was gentle, but her heart was racing. What had happened hours before had marked a turning point in her life. Stephen Siegel stood by the door with his arms crossed, watchful. He didn't seem tired despite the long journey and the emotional weight of the moment. His mere presence gave Anna the feeling that, finally, there was a wall between her and all the pain that had haunted her for months. "Dad, why did you come today of all days?" she asked softly. Stephen turned slowly. "Because I felt you needed me," he said. "Sometimes a father just knows." Anna was silent, her eyes filled with tears. Stephen sat beside the bed and took her hand gently, something few people would expect from a man of his stature and fame. "When I was a child, I thought you were invincible," Anna said. "Then I grew up and thought you didn't care anymore." Stephen squeezed her hand gently. "I always cared. I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day. But I wanted you to live your life, to be strong. I never imagined you would end up with a man who choked on his words, who forgot what it means to love." Anna looked at the baby. "I don't want my son to grow up seeing violence," she whispered. "I don't want to repeat what I went through." Stephen bowed his head. "And he won't," he affirmed. "Not while I'm here." At that moment, the door opened a crack, and the head of the most senior nurse in the hospital peeked in. "Mr. Siegel, there are reporters outside," she informed him quietly. "Someone leaked that you were here." Stephen closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and nodded. "What do they expect?" he replied calmly. "There's nothing to tell them." Anna looked at him in surprise. "Reporters, it's inevitable," he said. "But you don't have to worry. The important thing now is for you to rest and take care of your son." The nurse left, closing the door carefully. The room fell silent again. Stephen got up and walked to the window. He watched the rain fall on the asphalt illuminated by the street lights. His mind filled with memories, the years of discipline, the times he had had to intervene to protect someone, and above all, the silent promises he had made to himself. This time, he wasn't going to fail. "Anna," he said without taking his eyes off the street, "sometimes life puts us in situations where we have to choose who we want to be. Marco can still change, but that change depends on him. You can't save him, only you can protect yourself and your child." Anna nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered, "but it hurts." Stephen turned. "Pain is part of strength," he told her. "Not to keep you in it, but to propel you to get up." Anna took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, those words didn't sound empty. She felt she could believe them because they came from someone who had been through his own darkness. In the hallway, Marco sat in a plastic chair, soaked from the rain. His hands trembled, not just from the cold. His eyes were fixed on the floor as if searching for answers there. What had happened hours before had shaken him to his core. He wasn't a saint, but he didn't want to be a monster either. And for the first time in years, he felt real shame. A shadow crossed his field of vision. He looked up and saw Stephen leaving the room. His heart leapt. It wasn't a look of hatred that the man gave him, but one of evaluation, as if he were measuring whether there was anything redeemable about him. "Come on," Stephen said in a tone that brooked no argument. Marco got up awkwardly and followed him into an empty hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered. Stephen stopped and looked at him intently. "Listen to me carefully," he began. "What you did today is inexcusable. You hit a woman who had just brought your child into the world, my daughter. If you want to stay in their lives, you'll have to show them with actions that you're a different man. And I'm not just talking about pretty words or tears in a hallway. I'm talking about changing every single day." Marco looked down. "I want to," he murmured. "I don't want to lose them." Stephen took another step closer until he was standing right in front of him. "This isn't a game," he said. "I'm not a judge. I'm a father. And if you raise your hand to her again, you won't find me talking. You'll find me acting." Marco swallowed. "I understand." Stephen held his gaze for a few more seconds, and then nodded. "Then start now. Go back to your house. Clean that place up. Get help. Prove you can be someone trustworthy. You have no right to go near Anna or the child until she says so. That's it. That's clear." Marco nodded silently. For the first time, he didn't feel anger at an order. He felt someone setting a real boundary, one that could save him from himself. Stephen turned and went back to Anna's room. Marco stood alone in the hallway, staring at his trembling hands. Outside, the rain was still falling, but inside him, a small, faint spark was igniting, one that maybe, just maybe, could become something better. Inside the room, Anna was still with her sleeping baby. When Stephen came in, she looked up. He approached her and smiled slightly, trying to convey calm. "Everything's going to be okay," he said. "But we're going to take it one step at a time." Anna nodded. For the first time in a long time, those words weren't an empty promise. They were the beginning of something new. The echo of ambulance sirens still lingered in the distance as the news spread like wildfire. Stephen Siegel rushed into the hospital to protect his daughter. The tabloids began to arrive. Some reporters tried to get a glimpse of his face. Others shouted questions, hoping to provoke a reaction. But Stephen said nothing. His silence was more intimidating than any statement. Meanwhile, in an isolated room, Elena, his daughter, held her newborn baby, her hands trembling. Her tears were a mixture of pain, fear, and relief. In her mind, memories hurled themselves at her. The assault, her husband's cold stare, her father's imposing presence. It was like living inside a movie she never thought she'd star in. Stephen walked slowly into the room. His steps were heavy as iron on the floor, but his voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle. "Look at me, Elena. You're safe now. He will never touch you or my grandson again." She looked at him, trembling. The image of the action star the world knew contrasted sharply with that of the father now leaning over her, arranging a blanket around the baby. For the first time in a long time, she felt she didn't have to bear her pain alone. The husband, handcuffed and guarded by 2 police officers, shouted in the hallway, trying to justify himself, blaming her for everything. His words were insults that bounced off the closed door. Stephen listened, but didn't react. He knew that justice was already being served and that his presence should focus on healing, not revenge. "Dad," Elena whispered, "I don't want this to destroy my life. I want to protect my son." "That's what we'll do," he replied firmly. "You're going to rebuild your life, and I'll be here, not as a movie star, but as your father. This is my real fight." At that moment, a social worker came in, informing her that the hospital and the police had already activated protection protocols. Stephen nodded without arguing. He knew the legal battle would be long. But she also knew that the first step, breaking the cycle of violence, had already been taken. Near the window, the press remained crowded, asking if Stephen would use his influence to have the husband convicted. But he made no statements. His gaze was fixed on his daughter and grandson. His silence was a message. This isn't a spectacle. This is family. Elena lay back on the stretcher. With the baby asleep on her chest, she felt she could finally breathe. There was fear, yes, but also hope. For the first time, the word future didn't sound empty. She knew that with her father's support, she could start over. The scandal had already reached the news and social media. The whole country was commenting on the images of Steven Seagal entering the hospital with a firm step, like a guardian who could wait no longer. While the media speculated, inside the maternity ward, there was a different atmosphere. Silence, tension, and above all, the determination to protect Elena and her baby. Elena, still weak from childbirth, looked at her sleeping son in a nurse's arms. She felt broken, and at the same time relieved. Broken by the betrayal of the man who promised to protect her. Relieved that her father had appeared just when she needed him most. Stephen, standing beside her, didn't raise his voice or gesture. His mere presence was enough to command respect. When he spoke, he did so with that dangerous calm he had perfected through years of discipline. "You're not going to suffer again, Elena. This ends today." The police officers, who were keeping the aggressor handcuffed in a nearby hallway, lowered their gaze as Stephen walked past them. The husband shouted insults, but his voice was drowned out by the sirens and the murmur of the press. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his actions would have real consequences. A social worker entered the room with papers in her hand, restraining orders, protective measures, and contacts for psychological support. Stephen took them, reviewed them, and placed them on the table with a determined gesture. He knew the real battle was no longer fought with fists, but in court and in therapy, and he was ready to fight it. Elena burst into tears. "Dad, I thought I was going to die in there." Stephen leaned down and took her hand. "I've got you, daughter. You're not alone. You never were." Through the window, the crowd of journalists and onlookers could be seen. Stephen made no statement. He stayed with his daughter and grandson, protecting that intimate moment from the outside noise. For him, it was no longer a scene from a movie. It was real life. And in real life, a father defends and rebuilds. At that moment, Elena understood that the man in front of her was not just the action star everyone admired, but her father, willing to accompany her in the process of healing and starting over. For the first time in years, she felt she had a future.